Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Kamrath. I'm with the American Heritage Education Foundation. I'm the president and editorial director. And Claudine is here as well. She's also with AHEF. She's my sister. And AHEF is a nonprofit organization based here in Houston, and we're family run and operated. And our purpose is we are dedicated to the teaching of America's philosophical heritage. And this is to promote constructive citizenship. Our website is americanheritage.org, and we encourage you to go and check out some of our programs there and our resources. One of the things that we do is we have workshops for teachers. We also provide educational resources for teachers and citizens from K through college. And some of our resources are on the table here, and you're welcome to come look at some of those that we offer. And hopefully everyone picked up a brochure. We have a brochure that tells a little bit more about us, what we do, and it has our website information. So we invite you all to take a look at our materials. And I just want to say I'm really honored to be here today. I was invited by Pat to come. She was one of our book study participants in the past. And I just feel honored to be here and be asked to teach on July 4th. So thank you for having me. In honor of 4th of July, I'm here to talk a little bit about our nation's founding and hopefully to glorify God as well. I just want to share a little bit about how our nation came about. One area that we look at and study is America's founding principles, and many of those principles are influenced by the Bible. So we have a particular interest in looking at that aspect of our history. And I do want to talk today about one principle of our founding heritage, and that is social contract. This is a principle that was theorized by philosopher John Locke. And we're going to talk about how our nation formed by a social contract with our Declaration and our Constitution. We're also going to look a little bit at how contract reflects the biblical principle of covenants, if some of you might be familiar with that. So you're going to get a little bit of a history / philosophy / Bible lesson here today. So I hope you enjoy it. The presentation, as was mentioned, it's based on my book, on the research that I've done in my book called Miracle of America, and it's the influence of the Bible on our founding history and principles. So I encourage you to check it out if you'd like to find out more about other principles in our founding. My thesis in this book was basically to show and prove how the Bible influenced America's founding. And I do think that in doing the research, I did prove that the Bible is really important in our history and in our philosophy in this country. This is contrary to what many secularists in the past have tried to deny. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I just want to open in a short prayer, and then we can start. Lord Jesus, thank you for this time today. I ask that you would cover all that I say and do, that it would be an expression of you. And I ask you would open us to hear you speaking, if perhaps you might be telling us how we can focus on you and in our nation to keep our nation godly, because you are the source of our strength. Amen. So when the American Revolution broke out in the mid-1700s, The 13 original colonies had already been in existence for over 100 years. And during that time, the colonists enjoyed English rights, and based on their charters and based on the English Constitution. And we've got the 13 original colonies. They've already been around. And America had enjoyed minimal supervision from Britain and freedom to govern themselves for over a century. But changing political relations with Britain threatened the American way of life in the 1700s, and Britain imposed taxes and policies on Americans that Americans saw as violation of their rights and freedoms. Some of the rights that were violated are their right to freedom, rule of law, due process of law, trial by jury, innocence until proven guilt, freedom in travel in peacetime, no standing army or quartering of troops in peacetime, and no taxation without representation. Those are some of the main violations that occurred. And since colonists had no representation in British Parliament, they had no say on the laws that were enacted by Britain. And that left them in a powerless position to assert their rights. But Americans wanted more than just representation overseas. They really wanted to govern themselves. So during this time, the Americans embraced an idea called social contract, and this was expressed by John Locke. And Locke was an English philosopher of the Enlightenment, and he was widely read by founding era Americans, and namely his 1689 Second Treatise of Civil Government. In this treatise, he asserted that the idea that social contract is the basis of free and just civil society with a legitimate government. This social contract is an agreement among people to combine together and their rulers, with their rulers, on what their duties are going to be or what their duties are. And Locke favored social contract because he believed that all people possess God-given natural rights. And this contract was necessary to protect those rights. Some of man's natural rights you might be familiar with are life, liberty, and property. In our Declaration, we call them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are our main rights. Well, Locke imagined what life would be like having rights, but before or outside of civil society. And he called this a state of nature. And I kind of picture like a jungle with a caveman, but you're basically outside of civil life. So in that kind of a state, you have a lot of freedom, but there's no civil authority to protect your rights from violation by others. And because people are prone to infringe on other people's rights, your rights are always at risk when you're on your own, basically. Well, Locke saw that in order to survive, the people could join together and form a civil society, and that would protect their rights, and they could enforce laws. And in this society, you and me, all the citizens, we give up a little of our freedom by agreeing to submit to certain laws and agreeing to majority rule. And the hope is that we would be able to survive and have peace and better our lives. And he called this agreement the social contract. Well, one way we can define social contract is it's an agreement among members of an organized society. It's between the governed and the government. And it's recognizing and defining our responsibilities and duties for each party. And the purpose is to preserve and protect people's rights. So if the government violates people's rights, then that would be considered a breach of contract. And the people could reform the government, or they could change their governors, and so forth. And one important element to remember is that social contract requires consent. So it's not made by force or against people's will. It's a voluntary agreement. Locke describes the elements of a social contract, which is consent and majority rule, as the basis for legitimate government. And he says in his second treatise, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of freemen capable of majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And this is that and that only which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. So government has legitimate authority based on people's consent. That's what we come down to. Incidentally, consent goes hand in hand with liberty, because you have to be free in order to offer consent, right? And in order to be responsible for making and keeping a contract, you have to be free to be able to do that. So it kind of goes with liberty as well. And what many people don't know is that Locke derived the principle of social contract in part from covenants in the Bible, which is an interesting thing. In the Bible, God used covenants to relate to his people, and his people used covenants to relate to one another. So when God made a contract, it was like a promise. And when, I guess an example would be like when God made a contract with Abraham that he would start a new nation. That was one of the first covenants that he made. And when people make covenants, they are promises or they are binding agreements. And it's usually for a civil or religious purpose, basically. And what is unique about covenants is that a higher authority like God or king is usually participating in the agreement. So, like for example, you could have a covenant between the people and an authority, God or king. Or you could have one among people with the authority, like God or king, as a witness or a guarantor of the agreement. And the people would be accountable to that authority. And so it served to strengthen and reinforce the agreement, because you have an authority that you're accountable to. Covenants enabled fallible people to secure commitments to and from one another. Now, a similar kind of agreement is a charter. You might have heard of that. And that is where like a king grants rights or privileges to a person or a group of people. For example, the first Americans that came to America received a charter from the King of England to settle in America. A synonym for covenants is compact. It's another word, and it means like a pact, but I mean. So Locke was influenced by covenants in the Bible when he formed his idea of social contract. One person that informed Locke on covenants was the Scottish minister named Samuel Rutherford. And he wrote a treatise called Lex Rex in 1644, and it means the law is king. And in this work, Rutherford observed the political covenants in the Bible. So where the ancient Israelites often covenanted with their kings and their rulers, the kings would agree to rule justly and follow God, and the people would agree to submit on those terms. So an example would be in 2 Chronicles in the Old Testament, books 22 and 23. And this is where the Queen Athaliah usurps the throne of Israel, and this is without the people's consent. And the people remove her, and they covenant instead with their chosen king, Joash. So a verse in there, and then chapter 23, verse 3 says, "Then all the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God." So what Rutherford saw from these verses is that the Israelites freely chose and covenanted with their rulers. Well, Locke drew from this, in part from this kind of political covenant that he saw in the Bible through Rutherford, to create his secular social contract. One difference with Locke's social contract is that it didn't require religion or God. It didn't require a higher authority to participate. It could just be between equals, group of people. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Revolutionary era Americans loved Locke's social contract because they had lived by the covenant tradition for over a century. For example, you had the Pilgrim's Mayflower Compact in 1620. That was a covenant. And the Puritans' first laws in their early colonies were actually based on covenants. So Americans had experience with and understood these kinds of agreements. And they readily adopted Locke's social contract. Okay. I don't know what happened with that. I think we're missing some slides. I don't know what happened with those. So one notable revolutionary leader and founder was American founder Samuel Adams. And Adams actually took up Locke's idea of social contract, and he affirmed it as a voluntary agreement to form a civil society to protect people's rights. And he quotes in his report on the rights of colonists, 1772, he says, "When men enter into society, it is by a voluntary consent, and they have a right to demand and insist upon the performance of such conditions and previous limitations as form an original compact." Every right not expressly given up or from the nature of a social compact necessarily ceded remains. So he basically took up Locke's idea of social compact. Adams and other American leaders pointed to social contract as a foundation of their legitimate and just government and civil society. Okay. During the Revolutionary era, Locke's social contract became a major influence on American political thought, actually, and civil liberty. Americans saw in the social contract a basis for legitimate government and a basis for revolution against Britain. They argued that Britain's policies were made without consent and violated their rights. And so they saw it as a breach of contract, if you will. And they believed that Britain no longer had legitimate authority in the colonies. So they had a right to resist. And that was kind of their line of reasoning. When the American founders signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to declare independence from Britain, they actually applied a social contract. We see the application in the Declaration's agreement by consenting people to form a new nation. And the Declaration states, you should have that there, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In addition, the Declaration also reflects a covenant in a certain way because it appeals to a higher authority, which is God, the supreme judge. And it says, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, for the rectitude of our intentions, solemnly publish and declare these united colonies are and of right ought to be free, independent states." So the Declaration is actually considered the first part of our national compact among the American people to form a new people and a nation. It answers the who and the why. So it's the people, and they're making a decision to form a new nation to secure their rights. And later, the Constitution of 1787, that actually provided a framework and laws for the new nation's government. And it was also a consensual agreement that begins, "We the people of the United States do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America." And the Constitution was actually voted on and ratified by the American people. So it was an agreement also. And this Constitution became the second part of our national compact. It answered the how of the compact. By what government and laws will we abide as a people and agree to live under? So that was our second aspect of our compact. And what's really interesting is that the founders called the Constitution a federal constitution and the federal government that it created. And what's really interesting is the Latin root word for federal actually is foedus. And foedus means covenant or contract. So I think it's quite interesting that our federal government has a very covenant-like aspect to it. That word "fotis," the same word appears in the Latin Vulgate Bible. So if you look up covenant in that Latin Bible, it will say "fotis." The founders strongly believed that a covenant-like bond held our union together. Well, America's Declaration and Constitution demonstrated an exceptional event in history. It was a rare occurrence in the world, very unusual, by which free people joined together to form a new nation and a government, by which they approved their own laws and government. And this social contract, though it's secular, it reflects the biblical principle of covenants in the Bible, and it is still binding today after 245 years. Well, that is about a wrap for me on this presentation, but I did want to let you know that if you would like to find out more about other principles in the Bible and how the other principles in our founding and how the Bible influenced them, I encourage you to check out my book, The Miracle of America. We also have a blog on our website, the Founding blog, and there's a whole library of articles that you can read about different principles from my book as well. So I would encourage you to check those out as well. So I want to just thank everyone for letting me speak today and for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope you learned a little something new about our founding. Thank you.